So good evening, everybody, and welcome to Manchester Trades Council's November meeting. And our theme this month is bullying in the workplace. Right, the topic itself is an age-old one. We all have probably experienced being in a workplace where a manager or somebody who has more power than yourself exerts that upon you in a really unfair and intimidating fashion. Sometimes it can be because they're also being intimidated and they're at the end of their tether. Other times it can be an established part of the way that they treat people. As a branch secretary and a district secretary here in Manchester for the National Education Union, I am dealing with lots of casework at the moment, which is all around bullying. Some of that is being taken through a grievance process. Other casework that I'm dealing with, you have to talk very gently to the members involved, explain to them how you can try and protect them because they're scared even to stand up and speak for themselves. So it's a huge problem. I won't betray any confidences here. I'll just give you an example. There is one school in Manchester where the head teacher, every time I meet that person, they are the greatest friend of the trade union movement that you will ever meet, and we have a fantastic relationship. But every time I pick up a telephone and talk to one of their members in their school, they are terrified and crying on the end of the phone. So it's a very complicated dynamic, and hopefully we're going to explore that tonight. So we've got three great speakers. We've got Peter Middleman, who is the Northwest Regional Secretary for the National Education Union. We've got Mary Sayer, who works for Unite in Schools. And it's really going to be fascinating listening to Mary because she's trying to get the message out to young people in schools about what to expect in the workplace, in a good workplace. If you go and you organise and you join a union, what you should be able to expect, i.e. not being bullied. So it'll be good to hear about that programme that she's involved in. And then last, but by no means least, we've got Nigel Flanagan from the People's Assembly, amongst other things, but he's also a global union organiser, and he tells me he's worked in Africa, Russia, Palestine, India, Nepal and China. So it should be quite fascinating to listen to some of his stories. So without any further wait, we'll move on and we'll start the evening. So at the end of it, of all three speakers, there will be opportunities for question and answer or people to have a debate and ask questions. We won't finish any later than 9 p.m. So I'll hand over in the first instance then to Peter Middleman, Regional Secretary for the NEU in the Northwest.
Thank you, John, and thanks, comrades, for the invitation to speak tonight. Really looking forward to hearing Mary and Nigel's contributions. And I was just thinking as John was going through that introduction and describing the head teacher that he's come across, I don't know who he's talking about, but I wouldn't mind betting that the characters who display those types of traits were also claiming to be union reps at one point during their career. Poachers turned gamekeepers tend to be the worst. But John's right, bullying is actually really hard to define in some circumstances. It was actually the issue that prompted me to become an active union rep back in the civil service in the mid-90s. And my first real act was to negotiate a bullying at work policy, which I think is still in place, hopefully refined and updated now. But it was a bit of a struggle, partly because of the difficulty in defining what demonstrates or what represents bullying behaviour. It's also true, of course, that the law is no salvation, no way out, no solution to that type of behaviour. There's nothing unlawful about bullying people in work. There are bits and pieces of legislation around Health and Safety at Work Act, which can sometimes be used in respect of duty of care. There's some criminal law, particularly the Protection from Harassment Act 1997. But the burden of proof in those using that type of legislation is really high and really difficult to secure. In describing the phenomena of bullying, though, I think we also need to be aware that very, very often it's a cloak for racism, sexism, and other types of discriminatory behaviour. And if we can find a link to a protected characteristic in the manifestation of bullying, then it is often easier to use the law to try to address it. But I'm not going to focus much on that this evening. I wanted to widen it out and just touch on a couple of broad issues, hopefully not lending too much from what Mary and Nigel are going to say. I'm conscious that as the first speaker, I've got a bit of a free hand, but they might have some notes that they're urgently amending as I go through this. So I hope there's not too much crossover. It's very, very common. 47% of workers, according to the CIPD, claim to have witnessed bullying behaviour. 25% of workers claim that they have been a victim of some type of bullying behaviour in the last 5 years. You are more likely to have witnessed, to have experienced bullying behaviour if you are of Asian ethnic origin, or if you're a disabled worker, and that obviously refers back to some of the comments I made a few moments ago. From a school's perspective, I think it's worth just noting on behalf of the members that I'm representing here tonight that sometimes it comes from unusual sources. Only last week there was this story in the news about the TikTok Rate Your Teacher campaign, where children and parents were the source of bullying teachers based on their assessment of performance, but very often manifesting itself in certainly homophobic abuse, racial abuse, and other unwarranted behaviour designed to undermine the confidence and the status of teachers in the classroom. Of course, it does come from employers as well, through pernicious monitoring or observations, as they're called in the sector. Effectively, your boss standing at the back of the classroom, picking holes in your teaching practice to use against you, often as a means of forcing people out of the profession, and particularly affecting teachers of a certain age, and particularly women teachers of a certain age. And we're really vigilant to that in the NEU, and we act accordingly when it's appropriate to do so on an individual level. But I wanted to just touch in the time I've got left on what it means collectively, both in terms of industrial relations and some of the wider philosophical bases that I think give rise to bullying behaviour. So what can you do about it? I mentioned before about negotiating a bullying policy, dignity at work policy, equal opportunities policy, whatever title you choose to give it. There needs to be a mechanism for concerns to be raised in good faith, investigated in good faith, with outcomes that are fair and equitable. And clearly in unionised workplaces, that's much easier to do. Progressive employers tend to have a set of valued behaviours which can be used against bullying employers, or as evidence to be considered in a bullying grievance. And of course, a union that's present in the workplace can also negotiate around the nuts and bolts of how that workplace works, providing workers with an agency in the workplace and changing the power dynamic, which is absolutely crucial, lending itself more towards a pluralist model of industrial relations with an element of industrial democracy, where the workers in the workplace have a degree of control over the regimes that they're subject to, rather than the predominant, I would argue, philosophy in most workplaces, which is the unitarist model of industrial relations, where we're all on one side, all on the same side, one big happy family. If you disagree with the boss, it must be because of a misunderstanding of our shared goals, which is creeping in. In fact, and this is where I'll finish, that's a product, that unitarist model, where the right to manage can't be questioned, is a product of the development over decades and decades of human resource management, which manifested itself in the early part of the Industrial Revolution, and of course accelerated in the 70s and 80s to replace what used to be called personnel departments, for example. We had a fascinating contribution to a TUC event on the 150th anniversary, actually, from Professor Miguel Martinez Lucio from the University of Manchester's Industrial Relations Department. Really, really progressive and thought-provoking academic who made a contribution to a TUC event, who talked about human resource management taking the place of what used to be industrial relations. And I think it's worth just focusing on what human resource management is. The very language involved, humans as a resource, to be sweated, to be exploited, to be driven into the ground in the same way as beasts of burden were once treated, and machines are often treated, human beings being on the same par, occupying the same space, all about a mechanistic process, all about output, all about the bottom line and what human resources can contribute to that. So I will finish on this. Now, John talked about workers being scared to speak up. And I think all of that, together with that phenomenon, is absolutely drawn from the Marxist analysis of alienation, because that's what we're talking about here. It's a Marxist alienation. And Marx described four aspects: alienation from your product, the thing that you're trying to produce, whether you're an artisan, whether you're a machine worker, or whether you're a teacher. In the case of teaching, of course, the product is learning itself, and the people who are consuming your learning, the children. Once you become alienated from them because you're so devalued or bullied, then your practice will begin to diminish. Alienation from the act of production, ownership over the way that you do your job. In teaching, it was becoming increasingly automated. We are even talking about robots teaching classes of children in the foreseeable future. At the moment, it's human beings at the front of the class, but they are very, very often told what to teach and how to teach, taking any joy, creativity, or professional agency out of it. Alienation from your essence of being a human being. And if you've been subject to bullying or a horrible boss, you'll come away from work at the end of the evening feeling anything but human. It affects your mental health. It affects your outlook beyond work. And it has actually a dehumanizing effect. And very finally, an alienation from the relations of production. And if you read any more Marx on the relations of production, you'll see how it is an absolutely inevitable consequence of the history of capitalism. And bullying at work, I would argue, in opening a discussion tonight, is perhaps the best example of how bosses exploit other human beings to feed the insatiable capitalist appetite for profit and for greed. Our task is to educate our members to understand the political nature of bullying and organise them to resist it. So thank you for listening. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was excellent. You said several interesting things, but the thing for me as a caseworker that you mentioned about HR is really resonant, because it adds a whole different layer of variables into the casework that you're trying to do. And I know straight away when I see certain caseworkers' names, they will be brave enough to think outside the box and to be able to tell the employers they're doing something wrong. Whereas others, they won't just do what they're told, but they're scared themselves. You can see the way that they behave with their employer, and they won't go that extra distance. So, it's a multi-layered thing. Moving on, I'd just like to introduce Eddie Garner, who's the Vice President of Manchester Trades Council. He knows Mary Sayer really well, and he wants to just say a few things about the topic as well. So I'm going to hand over to Eddie just for a minute or so, and he will introduce Mary. So Eddie Garner.
Yeah, thanks, John, for giving me a couple of minutes here. Yeah, bullying at work, what is it and what are we going to do about it, in introducing some ideas. Yeah, of course, bullying touches on related topics, including stress, ill treatment, harassment, poor systems and more. And all employees have the right to be treated with dignity and respect in their working environment, free from bullying, harassment or discrimination. When we talk about bullying behaviour, some people don't realise that in the wider sense of bullying, if you look at the TUC and the HSE definition, because if you tell management TUC to say, oh, they would say that, whatever, but it's there in the HSE and the even CIPD, and they're all saying the same things about setting up to fail, micromanagement and all these things, This is included in the wider topic of bullying. And it's how the bullying affects people and how we can use the law and what remedies we've got. Some issues related to this is things like performance management systems that we know over the last few years. Our good friend Professor Phil Taylor spoke to us a couple of years ago, and he said about this horrible performance management system. Bloody awful, we'll discuss that some more. Exit the poor performers is what I heard a senior civil servant say a few years ago. Well, exit the poor performers. Poor managements think this is the way to be, to just lean on everyone. Whereas if you read some good stuff from the Institute of Leadership and Management, Dale Carnegie type thinking, treat people decently. Even the CIPD, you know, the human resource leaders, teaching body, has been saying for the last few years, you know, staff need to be treated much better as a, you know, fundamental part of the system. There's a fantastic book, if anyone's got time to get, called Bullying Sight by Tim Field, and some fantastic stuff in that. And he said things like, a manager may call you in the office and say, I've had a complaint about you. And what he means is, I've made up a complaint about you. And other things like, it's fantastic when you look into it, you know, how these things are. Some of the things that have been tried, really, like plasters over the wound, like having a red card and things, you know, resilience, well-being, mental health, first aid. Even though they got some merit, they just decide there really of putting the plaster over the wound. You know, prevention's much better than cure. I've seen people frightened to death by the absence management policies. I was in one meeting and there were 3 managers there. You know, they had 3 managers, you know, one as a secretary, you know, one as, oh, it was awful, three managers. Anyway, we've got to think of ways forward: legal, persuasion, education, collective strength and emotional support. So anyway, I'll shut up. I want to introduce Mary. Mary Sayer is doing fantastic work on the Uniting Schools programme. And of course, this month, it's Young Persons Month, isn't it? And the young persons are the future trade unionists. We've got to salvage, keep the, you know, trade union movement going and get the young persons fully involved. So let's just listen to Mary. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Ed. And thanks, John, for inviting me. And thanks, comrades, for having me. When I spoke to John yesterday, he was saying he wanted you to speak about how Uniting Schools tackles bullying. Well, I don't know if I'm actually going to do, if I can do that, because I don't know if that's what we do. But just a background, I think most people here, actually, I have spoken to at some point or other about Uniting Schools. You're well aware of it. We're incredibly under-resourced, so we haven't expanded as much as we should have, but we love doing it. Very healthy thing for member activists to get involved in, and very well received in schools. So basically, Uniting Schools, for those of you that don't know, you know, the labour movement had a problem 20 years ago, didn't we, where we were worried that young people didn't know what trade unions are. And it's certainly the case today, shockingly. The T&G, I used to be in the T&G, and we did, everyone said, you know, Len McCluskey, oh yeah, I've been into schools. Everyone's kind of, we did it very casually. I think a lot of us did go into schools and talk about trade unions, but then we made a concerted effort about 10 years ago to do a really structured, coherent campaign. And we've developed an hour-long session that we do, but we do, I get asked in some schools to do whole day sessions on protest and things like that. But basically, we try to do this. Our basic session is about, we've got 3 messages, really, in a session where we're demystifying, deconstructing trade unions. And we're talking about the power of identifying inequality and the power of collective action to solve it. And, you know, these kids are sophisticated, as some of you know. They're in terms of identifying inequality. Just look at the Black Lives Matter stuff. I mean, I'm so impressed by them all. But as John asked me the question, I was thinking, what do we do? What do we do about bullying? What do we say? It kind of underpins everything we talk about. And it is about, much of what we do is building confidence in young people to speak out, to get together, to change things. Without wanting to sound too woolly. So having the confidence to speak out against bullying, certainly. And then this idea that, you know, the bullying classroom replicates bullying hierarchy in society in general. So it's that kind of stuff. So our stuff is very much based on, and it's run by the activists. The activists have developed all the materials, they do the speaking. It's very much around student-centered learning, based in the student's experience. You know, we don't want reps to stand up and say, you know, in 1968 I became a rep. We don't want that anecdotal holding forth. We're trying to get young people themselves to talk about trade unions with us. And you go in the classroom and no one knows, no one, whatever class, whatever part of Manchester, whatever part of the country. We do this in all regions in the country. Young people don't know. They kind of have a guess. Trade, is it about Europe? You know, really quite depressing. But they've heard of strikes, obviously. So we're trying to address the imbalance done by the media and Thatcher, and you know. So we got the student-centered learning, which is very much centered in the student's own experience. So one of the first things we say is, you know, so what's a trade union? So a trade union is a group of people, the most natural thing in the world. When you've got a problem, you get together. And very much underpinning it is bullying, you know, the concept of bullying at school. This is what we do, because I was an officer before I was doing this. I was a qualities officer, I was an industrial officer, and it's very much about saying I used to get pulled into workplaces to settle bullying. And it happens all the time, just like it does at school. So they're very hot on bullying at school, as you know. And we work with student councils, developing anti-bullying policies, but meaningful anti-bullying policies. So, you know, in that sense, it does underpin everything we do. And this concept of needing protection in the workplace and support. And the more support you get, the more you, and the courage to stand together when you've identified inequality or bullying. And as Peter was saying, you know, inequality, bullying manifests itself through things like racism and sexism, homophobia. So we've got this film we show in our sessions, and we're doing a lot of work in FE at the moment as well. And I was doing some work with some, how did they term it? Neurologically diverse young people, really interesting young people who were really interested in this, and particularly the bullying aspect. So we've got a film we show that's about our young members, made by our young members, talking about their experience in the gig economy. So we're saying, you know, you're going into this, you can join a union, but you're going into this world of 0-hour contracts where we've gone backwards. And we talk about what unions have won, and we seem to be going backwards. And you're vulnerable. You're vulnerable. You're going to be quite vulnerable. And when I first started doing this 10 years ago, no one had heard of 0-hour contracts. Now, most of the kids in the class have heard of them. It's quite worrying. And I tell them this. They've heard of 0-hour contracts. And what we do also, we get the teachers, I always pick on the teachers and go, sir, miss, are you in a union? Are you in a trade union? And sure enough, you got a living example. The teacher will, and the kids are gobsmacked. And the teacher will say, yes, I am. And often they'll have a short anecdote as to why. And they were on unsteady ground, and the parent had been there, or one of the teachers, they needed the protection. So a very good living example, there's nothing more potent, as you know. So I say we work with school councils on their policies, but that's quite tricky, as you can imagine. So a lot of schools say, oh, we've got a school council, and they're kind of, the kids don't like them. It's just a few individuals who, you know, are involved with that. So we also increasingly do sessions on workplace rights and responsibilities. This is how we get into schools, workplace rights and responsibilities. And increasingly we show PowerPoints, but not too lecturing. They're quite interactive with games and stuff about law. You know, you're protected whether or not you're in a union. There are fundamental human rights laws that say you have to have a break every few minutes and protect you against bullying with them, which always brings us on to equalities and the protected characteristics. I'll come back to that, which, as we know, kind of is at the heart of a lot of bullying. So what I've done recently, we've got these bright, vibrant, I'm working with young members all the time, and I'm trying to get young members into schools. The kids seem to respond much more to young members talking about their jobs. They've just left school and gone into work. So we got these fantastic, ferocious young women in Glasgow who, from the hospitality sector, who are building their branch, and they were at the COP26 stuff with various actions. And there's one woman who I just kind of parade her around, but she's promised to teach. We're going to train up some of these young women all over the country, and they're going to come with us into schools as a real potent, living example of young workers who won't stand up, who will stand up to their bosses. They won't stand up to being bullied. They won't stand for being bullied. And they're in the process of building this massive branch and developing a proactive anti-sexual harassment policy for the sector, for the entire sector, hotels, bars, all these areas that these kids in schools are probably going to work in. The policy also they want to carry into our union to Unite, because we've got one, but they say it's not much good. We don't use it. It's quite tokenistic. They're brilliant. There's no stopping them. I really encourage them and support them, and they do get blocked quite a lot. So we do things. The other day we did some things with these neurologically diverse kids on, just to get them up in the classroom. A thing called a discrimination game. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a bit like Grandmother's Footsteps, where you give each person a role. So you've got an accountant on the one hand, then you've got an Amazon worker on the other, and you give them a little bit of background. You know, it's not role play, but it is in the sense you have to think yourself into the character. So you've got two kids, a wife who's not working, this kind of thing, or you're gay, you're disabled. So we made all these characters, lined all these kids up with their characters, and then you ask questions like, you know, can you afford to go on holiday every year? And do you have guaranteed hours per week and stuff? And if you can't say yes, you move one step forward. So all the all the accountants and the doctors and stuff win the race. It's quite a good visual way, and the kids really enjoy it, really get into it. And you can just see them clicking stuff as they go along. So that's one, but it's all about inequality rather than bullying. But as we know, as Peter said, you know, it's at the root of, a lot of it's at the root of bullying. So then we do a thing called the spectrum, which is where you've got, on the one hand, you've got agree and disagree. So also to get them up and running. I'm talking about this because we just did this the other day and it just worked perfectly, absolutely perfectly, with a PowerPoint about your rights at work. And they have a spectrum where they, we just ask them questions. Do you agree or disagree? And you have to go from one side of the room to the other. Again, they like it because they're running around. So things like young workers should be, statements, young workers should be paid the same as older workers. Do you agree with that? And there was quite a lot of difference. And, you know, people over the age of 16 should be allowed to have a vote, and a lot of discussion. And it was good. They ended up taking it, and we're having big discussions where no one could agree. And then the final one, which I wrote, was everyone has the same rights. And that was caused a huge consternation. It was brilliant. So half the people ran from one end of the room, half the people ran to the other. And that kind of seamlessly morphed into a kind of exercise, brainstorming exercises on equality, and then looking at protected characteristics, which, you know, in theory, by law, unless your employer doesn't implement them, which they don't, then we say, you know, the challenge is to challenge your employer. But just brainstorming protected characteristics, and they were good. You could see their brains working, you know, sex and sexuality. We had to get some of the terms right, but it was interesting. And everyone had experience. And disability stuff, of course, all these young people had mental health issues. So it was very, very good. Then we start talking about, do they work? Do these protected characteristics work? Well, you know, a lot of employers will do what they can get away with. And it's up to us to challenge them. And then we kind of ended the session with more film about young people identifying inequality and affecting change. So obviously you've got the Black Lives Matter and the climate change stuff. Just got to, you know, end on an inspiring note, having painted quite a dark picture about things going backwards and losing all your rights, and you having to challenge your boss and join a union because together you're stronger. So at the end of a good session, they tell us what a union should be doing, having not known anything about them, and they do after an hour. It's just fantastic. So what I'm saying is they identify with the bullying side, and then when you kind of replicate it in the workplace, and then when you say, by the way, you know, you might well be working in a bar in these non-unionized, you know, precarious jobs, which seems to be, you know, increasingly the norm. You've got to protect yourselves. You've got, you know, you might well join a union. You might join Unite Community if you're unemployed or in casual work, or you might join any union, but you should really for protection against things like bullying. So I hope that's okay. I've kind of gone off the subject a bit, but that's the essence of what we're doing, and it changes all the time. That's
fantastic, Mary. I think it's so important, the work that you're doing. As a teacher, I understand exactly what you're saying about children. Despite the fact that we all know bullying goes hand in hand with school days, we've been trying to fight it for years, we will continue to. That gives a bad picture of children, because the overwhelming majority of children are just so obsessed with justice, and they hate inequality. If somebody's getting picked on, or they think that something is wrong in the way they're being treated, they're very vocal, they're very mature about it. So I suppose now it's about channeling that amazing work that you do, so that when they go into the workplace, they can take that with you.
Yeah, exactly.
And I totally agree with you about the real life examples. Your Glasgow crew sound terrifying, and I'm a Scouser. But brilliant, and that's what people need to see. That you can stand up, you can say things to the hierarchy, and you can get away with it, and you can help give your fellow workers courage at the same time. So,
and you have to challenge your bosses because they don't enact this stuff. We go on about all the laws, all the rights, because that's what the teachers want us to do, and then we say, by the way, employers.
Thank you very much, Mary.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
So, moving on then, so I'll introduce Nigel. As I said before, he is involved with People's Assembly, but he's also a global trade union organiser. And I mentioned some of the countries that he's worked in. So I'm going to assume that he's going to have some good stories about that. And I'll hand you over to Nigel.
Oh, thank you, John. And thanks, Mary and Peter. I thought that both really good, punchy and informative sessions there. Obviously, they've spoken about everything I was going to talk about, so I've only got 2 things to say. But I thought, first of all, I'd scare the hell out of everybody by saying the name Priti Patel. Because you will remember that earlier in the year, Priti Patel was dragged out in public and accused by senior civil servants and their trade union of bullying people in the workplace. And what that really says is that bullies have got permission. They've got permission from the Home Secretary and the government to behave as they wish in all the pernicious ways that we know they can, and that bullying is something that is now, in the eyes of the government, acceptable. But if Priti Patel does it, well, you know, it's good enough for all the other little Hitler managers up and down the economy. But I also want to try and go off the track a little bit by reminding you, I'm sure you all remember as good comrades, in 2013, Bangladesh, there was an enormous factory collapse, and 1,134 women workers were killed because of a factory that was ignoring health and safety standards, such as they are. And what it did reveal is a widespread practice in that whole sector, not just in Bangladesh, but also in India and in Pakistan. And the impact of it was that it revealed the extent to which bullying and harassment was being used as a deliberate weapon to dissuade and deter any of these workers from organising trade unions. And there was great outrage at the time, quite rightly, and something was created called the Bangladesh Accord, and all these Western companies like Asda and Next and Marks and Spencer's all signed up to say, you know, we will recognise trade unions, we will abide by health and safety standards, we will have disciplinary and grievance procedures and all the rest of it. I know that in most places, it just didn't happen. But here's the thing. This year, on part of the People's Assembly work and another project that we've been working on with Jeremy Corbyn's Peace and Justice project, the same patterns of bullying and harassment have been revealed in the UK in similar sweatshop factories in Leicester, in Bradford, and other workplaces across the north of England, where factory owners operating the same levels of abuse, harassment, and bullying in order to deter the workers there from organising themselves into a trade union. And all kinds of threats related to immigration status and visas and passports are also deployed. So what I see is a picture that bullying is actually, it's like a plague inside work, inside this country. That this is not some kind of civilized economy we're working in where people have got rights and are allowed to exercise their rights in a reasonable manner. What we have is inadequate laws, trade unions that are not powerful enough, and employers who are willing to go to the maximum in terms of encouraging and deploying bullying as their own form of management. Because essentially, in many cases, the bullying activities, the bullying culture comes from the top. It comes from the managers, and it goes down the line into supervision. So you do get people working in schools under pressure, terrified of failing to meet deadlines in marking or attainment or whatever it is. And at the moment, I am working with UCU, the FE and HE Teachers Union. And I see it there with people absolutely beside about falling behind. And coupled with the use of fire and rehire and 0 hours, it has an enormous impact on the mental health and the financial well-being, and just even the sheer sort of conduct of life of so many millions of workers. And I picked up a few figures that I think you will be surprised at this, maybe, that in the NHS in 2018, which is the latest figures we could get, 12.5 million days were lost due to sickness absence relating to bullying. So, and that's frontline staff as well as, you know, admin staff and consultant and senior staff. And what a loss to the NHS that is, because although the NHS is one organisation, there's hundreds of different employers within it and all kinds of sort of variations in standards of practice. So the bullying issue is not a kind of add-on issue to wages and hours and contracts. It's at the very core of people's experience of having a job in the UK. And relating back to what Mary is doing in the schools, which I think is superb, by the way. At the moment, only 4.4% of trade union members are under the age of 24. And that has been getting worse and worse and worse every year since I was a young person. So you can see how far back we're actually bloody going. But I mean, that is a shocking statistic. And yet that issue of bullying is the one thing at work that they will experience more than anything else. And what we've got to come up with a strategy that connects these things together to assist in union rebirth, to increase our density, but also to address a major issue. Because if you're a young worker, you're more likely to be bullied at work than you are in many other age categories. That, unfortunately, is a sad fact of life. But if you belong to one of the protected characteristics as listed under the Equality Act, and you're a young person, you are more likely to be bullied. And then the other significant flip side of that is you are less likely to be bullied if you're at work in a workplace where there's a recognised trade union. And these are the simple things, the simple messages that we have somehow got to get out into the working population, and in particular to young people. So, you know, we can, Peter's already stolen my thunder in terms of the statistics from the TUC website, which are quite shocking. And I would recommend, just have a look. It's only a brief read. Have a look at the ACAS website. It's only a brief read. And you can see that bullying and linked to it, harassment, are essentially probably the most pernicious issue for people at work today. That's not to say that wages and hours and contracts don't matter. Of course they do. But everybody experiences bullying at some point. And those figures that Peter read to you, 1 in 10 bullied in the last 6 months, 1 in 4 bullied in the last 5 years. If you extrapolate out of that, young Asian workers, young Black workers, gay workers, you know, trans workers, it gets worse and worse and worse. So the issue is serious. It should be a major priority for trade unions. I know some are putting it at the front of their campaigns, but it should be an issue for all of us in the People's Assembly, in all our projects, in all our campaigns. We could have senior politicians like Priti Patel can actually just laugh off the fact that she's been accused of bullying and got away with it. Well, then there's not much hope for the young kids working in McDonald's or in Amazon or anywhere else where the unions are absent. But I would like to finish there and say thank you for inviting me. I hope what I've said provokes a little bit of discussion, and thank you again to Peter and Mary, who I think set the scene really, really well. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Nigel. We're going to move on to questions and answers. So I'd like to thank all 3 speakers, and hopefully they can stay with us for the next 20 minutes or more. If you are going to say something, could you use your electronic hand, please, because it's just easier for me to see. Maybe I'll start it off, because one thing that I was going through my mind while we were hearing the speakers was that Peter started talking about legislation at the beginning of what he was saying. I know Peter's very involved in the Northwest TUC. And then Nigel, when he was starting talking, was saying that we don't live in the civilized economy that we think we do, which was quite interesting. So my question to the panelists really is that obviously we can do both, but will we ever get justice or protection from legislation? Is it worth pushing and pushing for that, or is it better to put our resources into empowering people in the workplace?
I don't mind having a go first, John. Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, we should continue to do both, and the respective weight of effort and energy that we put in might have to be determined by the shade of capitalism that's represented at the governmental level. I mean, it's certainly true that there has been some progressive employment law in the 1990s, for example, that we're still benefiting from today, and there's no reason why that couldn't be expanded. But I think we just need to be conscious of the limits of that aspiration. And if anything, this is not the position of the NEU, it's certainly not the position of the TUC. But if anything, I think what we've witnessed is 40 years of fallen union density, 40 years of fewer and fewer workers being covered by collective bargaining arrangements, and a greater reliance on the law, very often European law, which in my view is limited anyway, certainly limited on a collective basis. There might be some bits of legislation around the edges for individuals that have been won from Europe. But when that goes, if you haven't been mending the roof while the sun was shining, as it were, then you've got no industrial base to fall back on. And when you then see from headlines in the Times from the leader of the TUC that says things like only the single market can preserve our hard-won union rights, for the leader of the workers' movement to say that there's no alternative to legal redress, I think is a damning indictment of the state of industrial weakness in the British economy. And we've certainly taken our eye off the ball. That's been reflected in 40 years of fallen wage share as well. So for all at all currently about living wages, real wages, minimum wages, universal credit. In 1976, the high water mark, British workers secured 66 pence in every pound of wealth that they created. That's the best it's ever, the best we've ever had it. 2/3 of the wealth that workers create, we get paid as wages. The rest is profit and tax. 40 years later, 2016, that was down to 54 pence in a pound. So that 12% reduction over 40 years in today's money, using last year's GDP, is 240 billion pounds of wealth that we created last year that was taken out of our pockets by the bosses. That's equivalent to £7,000 each for all 34 of Britain's workers, whether they're at the bottom end of the pay spectrum, in the middle of the pay spectrum, or at the top of the pay spectrum. Anyone who gets a wage is £7,000 a year worse off because of that fallen wage share. That to me is in a nutshell what we need to address, because when we're in a position of strength to address that, you will also see manifestations of workplace bullying, racism, unfair treatment, unfair dismissal, and all the rest of it disappear as well, because our strength in the workplace ultimately will determine our success in achieving any semblance of workplace justice.
Thank you very much, Peter. Does anybody else want to comment on that before I just move to two people who've got their hands up? Okay, Chris.
Oh, sorry, John, I'll just say one thing in answer to that, because I like what Peter was saying. That's really, really great information. But the thing I said in my presentation, which I want to come back to later, is if you were in a workplace where there's an organised trade union, you're far less likely to be bullied. And I think that is where, that's the direction we should be going. Sorry to interrupt, John.
No, okay.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I do. I'm a passionate believer in self-organising and educating the workforce, whether they're in a union or not, dare I say. But I do think self-organising, that's where the where workers' awareness, workers' consciousness comes from, as we've seen with the young women in Glasgow, a ferocious lot of women who don't stand for anything, who are criticising the union that's kind of obstructing them, but also resourcing them and wielding them out and saying, right, you go to the Labour Party conference and be an angry young woman. But, if you ask for any resources, we won't. So I'm a real believer in education and building the reps movement if necessary. But I also think young people, as you were saying earlier, John, I think young people have much more of an innate sense of inequality than we do. They're much angrier. They've got more to be angrier about. And, we ignore them at our peril.
Thank you, Mary. Right, I'm going to go to Chris Jones and then after him, Paulina.
Hi, I must admit, I've never that much thought about bullying particularly in the past. I mean, I've dealt with it a bit, as a rep and what have you, when incidents have happened. And I've tended to think of it as something that, a bad one, picking on somebody who's a bit weak or whatever. But in fact, the sense I get from listening to people and what we're actually talking about is bullying as strategy. That is consciously and overtly used as a method and a way of control, which is not to say there isn't individual cases of nutters who pick on somebody because they're weak or they see them as inferior or whatever it might be. But I think, and I don't know whether it's just me missing the point and not noticing it, or whether we're actually presenting the issue in the wrong way, and we should be very much starting with it as a strategic thing. And I really identified with what was said earlier about, I think it was Peter who started it off, about HR replacing personnel departments. Because I mean, I know I don't look old enough, but when I first worked back in the 70s, there was personnel departments, and I worked for the Littlewoods Mail Order Company. Now, there's a lot wrong with that company, but it was paternalistic, and its personnel departments were paternalistic. They looked out, for people. They protected weak people. They looked after people who had problems. I might be overdoing it, and they might be really pleased, given what happened back there in the past, to hear me saying that. And I think that shift is one of the ways that what I'm trying to get at has been institutionalized. Perhaps. And the very fact that, I've worked for a few small employers where effectively there is a company that provides HR, which means there's no human involvement in this at all. It literally is, mechanistic and control. End.
Thank you, Chris. I'll move on to Paulina.
Thank you. I just wanted to say a bit where I'm coming from, because I work with a long COVID support group, which represents people living in long COVID, and I work specifically with an employment group of that, advocating for people who are living now with long COVID in the workplace. And it's a consequence of having caught COVID at whatever stage really in the past 2 years and developed long-term symptoms, which still go on. And I think people don't realize just how long they go on, because statistics stop at 12 months. I've been living myself with it for 20 months, and so have many people who fell in March when there was no testing and you just couldn't get help. And what we're seeing, and that's the reason now our group really exists, is a lot of people being threatened or losing their jobs, and a lot of people actually facing bullying and discrimination in the workplace as a way of pushing them out, so that if they are not actually sacked, they are forced to leave through absence procedures, or they're forced to leave just because they cannot fight that battle. I am an NUJ, I'm an ex-NUJ rep in National Union of Journalists, and I work with trade unions now, work for the TUC, work with NUJ, other unions, and we are working with the TUC to try to kind of develop an education for reps so they can better support people living with long COVID. But what we're finding, and I've done that survey and TUC have done that survey, that the majority of people, the vast majority of people living with long COVID now, are from the front lines. They are either NHS workers or they're teachers. So they are, they would have caught COVID in their workplace where they were not adequately protected. And now they are the people losing their jobs. In the TUC survey, 52% have experienced discrimination or harassment at work. From our survey, about similar percentage of people just cannot return to work. There are, adjustments are not being made for them, and they are struggling, and just, they keep having to return because the absence policies are not there for them. And they can't because it's a relapsing condition. So a person might be better 1 week and then just completely collapse the next. And that's not being taken into account. And my first advice to anyone who comes to us for advice is join the union. If you're in a union, go to your rep. If you're not in a union, join one. But what we're also finding is that the unions are often not able to represent people. And they might not have been a member long enough. It might be that they've only been in their workplace for less than 2 years. And because the protections kind of stretched out, you now need to be there for 2 years to get any support. Sometimes union rep just doesn't know what to do. So I always say, please don't go into a meeting with your boss by yourself. Because, you're going to be struggling. They're going to be pushing you, pressing you down. Don't assume that HR is going to be your friend. They are not. They're on your boss's side, not your side. And so the reps really need to go there with the people, but sometimes they just sit in and listen, and they're not active, and they're not, they're not advocating for their members. And where it's not a unionized place, and the union is trying to make it a unionized place, sometimes they don't want to confront the bosses because it's politically inconvenient for them to do so. And so they don't challenge, and they don't support the grievance procedures. Or if somebody brings the grievance procedures or try, go down unfair dismissal route or constructive dismissal route, Thompson solicitors won't represent them because the case is not robust enough, and the burden of proof on them, and the burden of proof needs to be quite high. So that's what kind of we are finding, that just aren't those protections, that the reps often are not trained to deal with this particular issue. So my question is really, what more can we do? What more can we do to educate reps to enable them to support people with long COVID in the workplace?
Thank you, Paulina. Hopefully we can come back to that in a bit. I'll be interested in that because I work with people doing casework who've got long COVID, and in my area, education, at the moment the employers are treating them fairly okay in the city of Manchester, which I represent. But my worry is that, for example, when the government changed its advice on women who were in their third trimester in relation to COVID, although most of the schools in Manchester continue to have a really positive attitude, some started showing cracks appearing, and immediately the government advice changed. They were really pushing for those women to be in work. And my worry with long COVID is that will happen as well as the government changes its current advice about it. So it was a good point that hopefully we can come back to it. But we've got a lot of hands up, so if you don't mind, I'll just ask some other people to make contributions. So Jay Doswell.
Hi everyone. Thanks for the speeches. They were really, really good, and it's good to hear about uniting schools. It's good to see you, Mary. I was involved in that, and I'd recommend that everybody gets involved because it's just brilliant. It's so worthwhile. I just wanted to make a point about. I'll leave out a lot of the details because it relates to my own personal situation, but I'm going through what I think is probably bullying at work. Everybody here who's a trade unionist will describe it as such, but because it's my own situation, I'm sort of like, is it, doubting myself, is it actually bullying? Am I making mistakes? Is this happening? So when I become a counsellor in 2019, my work basically changed their attitude to me completely. They started imposing kind of personals, but basically implying that my performance was slipping. I had mental health problems at the time as well, which they knew about, and they basically come down on me like a ton of bricks. And my boss has made comments about my sexuality. She singled me out, basically, saying that my performance is poor in front of other colleagues, and they've imposed retrospective penalties on me in a personal PIP, personal performance review. They've basically failed me for stuff that I'd done 2 years ago. They've just been absolutely awful. But I work in an office place that is a 9 to 5 corporate law firm. Well, it's not 9 to 5, it's supposed to be, but it's actually 9 to 8, 9 o'clock at night. So it's one of those very corporate kind of anti-union environment. So I'm wondering how we reach out to that demographic in Manchester, because there's a huge number, and especially now because of COVID, there's a huge number of people that will be working in offices that are where they don't even know. I mean, they'll be my age, possibly a bit younger, where they don't know that trade unions exist. They don't know that they are there to help them. And I mean, my branch is Northwest Legal and Finance for Unite, and 3 or 4 people, great people, but only 3 or 4 people out of 1,500, 1,600 turn up to the meetings. And I'm sure that we could really do something here with this demographic, because I think they're being treated really poorly, but because that kind of work is seen as professional rather than kind of like manual labor or something like that, they're almost overlooked, but actually they're overworked and quite a lot of the time underpaid. And with COVID, we're all told, well, you're just lucky to have a job, so put up and shut up. And I think that's so common. So I'm just wondering how we encourage people to come forward if they are being bullied in that kind of workplace, and let them know that the trade unions are there for them, because it just doesn't seem to, those two dots aren't connected at the minute, I think. But yeah.
Thanks, Jade. I mean, as a officer in Manchester myself, if you were one of my members, I'd be saying that although you might be small numbers in the workplace, there will be some really easy wins that you can get. So rather than going for all the big things, what I would be advising members to do would be to meet regularly, organise, pick a small number of targets that they can easily win. And then that starts to attract attention and starts to draw people in. Obviously, you need further help from the wider Northwest office for your union to try and recruit people. But that idea about making simple victories, and it starts to snowball, and people start saying, "Oh, okay, so being in a union helps," and they will start joining. So you don't always go for the big ones. You start off with the small things first. Okay. I mean, others can come in on that, but we've got quite a few hands up, so I'll just move on. Ed Garner.
Yeah, just to come back. Yeah, fantastic words by all colleagues here. And yeah, we've got to turn this into positives. Really, the title of today's meeting's too small, bullying at work. It's really the whole ambit of how people are treated or not looked after at work, you know, dignity at work, workplace justice, as Peter said. We need more education, not just rely on the law, collective strength, really push for health and safety, as we know some of the things that have gone wrong during COVID and people not protected. Systems where they don't work and then the staff get blamed, like the IT system where it's totally defective. And of course, PCS at the moment is considering what to do about, you know, a not good IT system. I'll say no more. There's also the idea that was touched on, human resources management. There is one school of thought: treat people mean and a lot will clear off. And you don't have to think about redundancy and stuff. There is that school of thought. On performance management, again, I know that a few years ago, not many years ago, there were colleagues spending many, many hours each evening evidencing what they'd done in the day, writing it up, because they had to have huge files. Unbelievable. This is on top of the job, you know. Dread was the word that colleagues used. They dreaded next day. And of course, we know the mental health and physical as well as mental suicide. On COVID, people felt press gang to go in work. All these things catch up on people. Reps themselves can be victimised because even though they're doing the job with inadequate facility time, they're trying to help everyone else. Where they can be vulnerable themselves is their own work. Someone can start micromanaging their work and singling them out, because it's got to do the same amount of work as everyone else, apart from doing the trade union role, and they can be vulnerable there. So we've got to turn it all around. Good collective strength, education, good leadership. Leadership's a fantastic thing, not bullying management, but good leadership, treating people decently. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Ed. I've got 2 hands up, but I just wonder, could we just consider 2 questions that have come out of the last couple of contributions. One was that long COVID is obviously a new thing, and it is something which we are starting to see people being bullied out of the workplace, because it's basically easier to do that than to allow them that extra time to cope with this new disease. And the other one was about, you know, incorporate anti-work anti-union workplaces, what are the best ways of trying to get in there and expand numbers? So I'm just wondering if we come back at the end, maybe our panelists could have a think about those two questions. But in the meantime, I'll go over to Norma, who's got her hand up.
Thanks, and thanks for the talks. They were excellent. I think, I mean, bullying and discrimination in the workforce isn't new, but the fact that it's become so culturally embedded, you know, as Nigel was saying, it's been okayed at every level. And especially with the creation of the hostile environment around people seeking asylum and anybody claiming benefits, and the trashing of anybody who works for local, you know, in public sector as opposed to private sector. All of that creates the culture that it's the norm. But what I wanted to ask people was that, you know, what do we do about our own organisations? I mean, in the Labour Party and the trade unions, we tend not to call it bullying, we call it witch hunts, but we're not exactly setting standards by which we can reverse and encourage people to think that it's okay and it's better to be in a union. And I know we as an organisation in the Trades Council see that as linking and solidarity with people, and solidarity and organising is what we need. But I do think we can't ignore the fact that, you know, our own labour movement organisations have the same traits as the rest of the society, and it just feels okay. So I'd just like some feedback on that.
Thanks, Norma. Sadly, you are correct about that. So hopefully we can come back to that in a minute. Annette, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, well, we can come back to it straight away if you like. I mean,
I thought you might.
We certainly can't ignore that, can we? And we mustn't do. I think this has been a really, really useful discussion. And I think maybe it's something that Manchester Trades Council needs to do some more work on, because I think it's almost a kind of gap in the trade union market, really, because as Pete said, you know, there's lots of focus on discrimination and unlawful discrimination, and you get a case as a union rep and you're almost looking for it. Is there something I can do here to raise a legal case? But many times there isn't, or the member themselves doesn't think there is. You know, it's not for us to say someone's been unlawfully discriminated if they don't feel that they are. So, you know, what do we do with bullying, and how do we recognise it? You know, and what is it? And I suppose I think there's two things going on with bullying. I think there's the pure, like, try and get more work out of people type bullying. And then there's also a sort of aspect of human behaviour of people abusing the power, and some of the stuff that's written around domestic abuse, I think, can apply to bullying in the workplace as well. And some of the same strategies, knowingly or unknowingly, I think people use against each other in the workplace and in the movement. And I suppose my way of looking at this, really, if someone asked me, do you think I'm being bullied, is kind of, you know, is it real? Is it reasonable? And how does it make you feel? So, you know, if you're being accused of something at work, you're not doing enough work. Is that true? Is the first thing. And lots of times cases I get at work, the actual thing that's being said to the member is not true. Your colleagues are doing better than you. Well, are they? Let's have a look at the facts here. Is it reasonable? You know, your colleagues off, you've got to cover their work as well as your own for the day. Well, clearly that's not reasonable, is it? Because, you know, there's only 24 hours in the day and there's only one of you, and you can't duplicate yourself. And there is a kind of concept in employment law, isn't there, of what reasonableness is and what a reasonable person would consider to be reasonable. And we kind of need to think that we are all reasonable, and just look at the set of circumstances we're finding ourselves in, and see whether it makes any sort of rational sense. And coming on to sort of long COVID and any other disabilities and health conditions that anybody might have, you know, that what is reasonable might shift for different people at different times, because they might have more constraints on what they're able to do than this colleague that they're being compared with. So I think, you know, we have to kind of teach each other to apply that test to things. And then how it makes you feel. This isn't almost said as much, it's kind of accepted more than when I started being a union rep, that, oh, well, work's stressful. Well, you're going to feel under stress. And I think maybe we need to find a new way of looking at that, because it's not reasonable to feel under stress. You might have some aspect of pressure at work that is unavoidable. You might even decide to put yourself under a bit of pressure. You've got something you need to do. You set yourself a deadline because otherwise you would decide the windows need cleaning and not do it. You know, so some kind of aspect of pressure is there within any tasks that we do. But even stress, you know, isn't a good thing. We shouldn't be putting ourselves under stress, and nobody should be putting us under stress. So if we're feeling different than we feel when we're not at work in a bad way, then I think we need to be considering whether that's reasonable as well. And it probably isn't, and it probably is to do with some sort of workplace bullying. So I've gone on for a bit, sorry, but I think something we can do within this organisation is try and do some more work on workplace bullying, because I don't think people are aware of it. I think it's happening all over the place. I think by us focusing on that might help us understand some of the things that are also going on in the labour and trade union movement, and kind of get a bit of perspective on that as well, and, you know, realise that it's not a kind of acceptable way of behaving wherever you are, and help us to challenge it wherever we find it.
Thank you, Annette. I haven't got any new hands up, so I'm going to go back to those two questions. And I'm going to unfortunately put the panelists on the spot a little bit. I'm just wondering, do Pete, Mary or Nigel have any views on the first question, which was about long COVID, which is, you know, as we said, it's brand new to everybody, but it is now a focus for people being bullied in the workplace, in some workplaces. And I'm just wondering, is there anything that anybody would like to contribute from that, from the panelists?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Paulina if you've been in contact with Hilda and Janet at the Hazard Centre. That's where I would direct you.
Yeah, I've been in contact with
Right.
Janet, and I spoke with the Hazard Companion.
Were they any use? Or?
I think it was helpful. Just the general discussion will probably which will carry on. I think I was very glad that they're that's being taken seriously, and they're working with the health and safety group in my union.
Yeah. That was my only contribution, because they're very good contacts.
Because I'm in Greater Manchester as well.
Good. And again, I suppose it comes down to how effective the trade unions have been in your profession. So going back to education, we have certain guarantees. One's called a Burgundy book about our health and safety, and that sort of guarantees that teachers, and there's also similar conditions in the Green Book for support staff. When there's a contagious disease, it sort of relates to that, whereas all the professions which haven't traditionally been organised in terms of trade unions don't have those policies in place, which is, again, comes back to what everybody's been saying tonight about if there's more trade union organisation in your workplace, the health and safety is going to be greater. And that brings me to something Annette mentioned, because I don't think we've talked too much about stress tonight, but the end result is always going to be stress, and stress is the silent killer. And then we've got members dying literally of stress every single year, and it's a significant end result of the bullying that happens, and it has to be seen as something really significant. Moving on then, maybe we can get some more more views about organising in workplaces which might seem slightly more difficult to. Again, if I could just put the panelists on the spot. Anybody got any ideas from there? I mean, Nigel,
I mean, this is the issue. This is the issue. There's nothing else matters as much, because I talked before about the 4.4% of union members who are under the age of 24. The other demographic that's about to hit us is that the age profile of the trade union membership is moving through the decades, so that we are about to hit a bit of a cliff because the average age of a trade union member is something like 56 years old. And within 10 years, many of these people are going to be retired or leaving work or dying, and we're not replacing them. And all the projections at the moment are that by 2030, the trade union density in the UK will be down to 18% from its current 23%. So there's no kind of like time for little pilots and trying fancy ideas and maybe having a little bit of a go at this and a little bit of it. This has to be the fundamental strategy of the movement now, is to reorganize and recreate the trade union movement and hit those levels that Peter talked about in 1976, because that level of income retained by the workforce in 1976 coincides exactly with the optimum strength of the British trade union movement. So, but how do we start here, on the ground? Well, we have to demand resources from our union to be able to do it. We have to start talking to workers. We have to start talking to young workers immediately. And I think the issue that we have to raise with them is the issue of bullying, because just about everything that affects us at work these days, the style of managing what affects us at work is the style of bullying. And that is a big change from 20 and 30 years ago. So now it's perfectly acceptable in our culture, in our economy, in our society, to be, keeping people on temporary contracts, keeping them on the end of a string, keeping them feeling very precarious and very worried. And if they show any kind of attitude of resistance or any kind of attempt to assert themselves, well, then the bullying comes in hard, because the bullying is supported by the system, by the boss, by the politicians, by the media, and everybody else. So it's not something we can just start on our own. It's a demand we have to make inside the movement about what we are doing with the resources we've got, because those resources now need to be fully redeployed into reorganizing workplaces. And I just wanted to say to Jade as well, Jade, sorry to hear about what you're going through. It's really difficult, because the answer I give doesn't give you any immediate sort of comfort. I realise that, but I genuinely think that this is an issue for the movement, that it has to change its direction and it has to change its core strategy, so that people are not left on their own in the way that you are.
Thanks very much, Nigel. I'm going to bring Lynn in a second, but before I do, Peter Middleman, could I just bring you in, please? Obviously, in education, we're lucky we've still got quite a high density of trade union membership within the profession, but we do encounter multi-academy trusts and private schools where we have real difficulties. I'm just wondering, could you say a couple of words about that?
Yeah, I can do briefly, and then I'll just touch on some of the points that Jade made as well, because they struck me particularly. So this is a good introduction, John. Thanks for that. Although from our perspective, we're spread over too many unions, about 95% of teachers are in one union or another. And that means that the dynamics within the sector should be stacked in our favour. Doesn't always manifest itself proportionally. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but
oh, somebody's just got their microphone on. Could you just mute yourself, please?
So that is a dynamic, and John's right. Some of the fragmentation of the sector into the private sector is designed to weaken the collective bargaining structures that we've got. I wouldn't say we've reacted in the way that the rail sector unions did in levelling up when they fragmented. We are fighting a bit of a rearguard battle, and lots of our internal democratic structures are set up on historic constructions of organisation rather than contemporary constructions of organisation, and I think that's a weakness that the union is still grappling with, which brings me to Jade's point, because there's nothing that Nigel said that I would disagree with. He's absolutely right that the answer to this is union organisation. But the one thing we have to recognise that is different from 1976 is that traditional employment methods or not what they were. We never all worked in big factories, don't get me wrong, but there is a precarious workforce out there that is growing exponentially. There's bogus self-employment, you've got internships, you've got third sector organizations that on the face of it can appear paternalistic, but in practice actually sort of represent some of the worst employers. And just because there isn't a union recognized doesn't mean that I think we should forget some really basic principles of solidarity. So regardless of where you work, if you witness somebody that looks vulnerable being picked on or bullied by the boss, we've got a human obligation to rally around and provide support to that individual in the form of an arm around the shoulder or making them a brew, but actually also talking to our colleagues. Have you seen the way they're treating Joan? Have you seen that they made John leave the office crying last night? Are we going to put up with that, or should we say something about it? And I think the societal changes that makes people look the other way or think, because I'm not being picked on, I'm going to keep my head down, is a real big barrier that we've got to overcome. But it doesn't matter whether Unite or Unison or the GMB or whoever it is active in your workplace. That basic human decency, I think, is something that people who recognise it, Jade, I'm sorry, have probably got a responsibility to try to cultivate amongst those that might have a different perspective. You can be a workplace leader without being an elected union rep, I think is what I'm saying. And then the one thing I would just add about ununionised workplaces, a bit of a plug for a liberal construct, but Andy Burnham made a manifesto pledge to introduce a good employment charter to Greater Manchester. The TUC were in the middle of constructing that charter on employee voice and employee engagement and trade union recognition. What's on the paper is actually quite good. I'll post a link in the chat in a minute. If you work for an employer that considers themselves a good employer but doesn't recognise a union, push them towards getting charter recognition, because the charter panel will question them about why a union recognition agreement is absent, why they don't recognise unions. So that's a bit of a backdoor way in, perhaps, to allowing a union and some access to the workforce to try and recruit, to reach a critical mass and to win recognition. Look at the charter. We've raised some concerns about some of the decisions the panel have made, but at least we're in the room to raise those concerns. The actual charter itself is definitely worth a second look, particularly if you're in an ununionised workplace.
Thanks, Peter. We've got just over 5 minutes left, so Lynn's got a hand up. I'll go to Lynn, and then we'll see where we stand in terms of the end of the meeting. Thanks, Lynn.
Hi, I've just got a couple of things that I've thought about, which is certainly in my sort of experience, but it's taken a while, but we've kind of discovered that quite a lot of what the bullying is that we see is like, could come under like gaslighting and something called sea lioning, which are two terms that I'd never really heard of before. So it's quite difficult, that would probably come under the bit of quite difficult to know whether bullying's going on or not, because it's the kind of stuff that makes you just think that you're going mad. So I was wondering what the speakers kind of had to sort of say about that. And the other thing is I've just sort of recently found out about the new legislation that's coming in Ireland about the right to disconnect, which says it's like a code of conduct that says you can disengage from work and refrain from engaging in work-related electronic communication, such as emails, telephone calls and other messages outside normal working hours. So I've only just found out about it, but it'd be quite interesting to know kind of what comes from that and whether the speakers or anybody else knows anything about that.
Thanks, Lynn. So your first question was about gaslighting, and what was the other term, Lynn?
Sea lioning.
See, I'm not new to me.
Yeah.
Anyone shed any? I mean, I know what gaslighting means, where somebody's actively trying to persuade you that you've gone mad and that something that hasn't happened has, or the other way around.
Mm-hmm. I think it's something along the lines of.
I think Paulina wants to come in on that, so let's give her a go.
If somebody asks you, okay, I'll let somebody that knows what they're talking about say it. I think.
Yeah. No, I just thought I had come across that. I just want to clarify that when somebody is trying to engage you in a long and protracted argument, and they are trying to pretend that they are sounding reasonable, and they might be asking the most ridiculous and stupid questions and making outrageous points, you know, like sexism doesn't exist, that sort of stuff. And you are the one who has to explain to them why, yes, sexism exists, or disability discrimination, or whatever. And you are the one, because you are getting stressed and becoming long-winded and getting agitated, you're the one who ends up sounding unreasonable. And they, from there, you know, high platform of sexism doesn't exist, or racism doesn't exist, or, you know, all of lives matter, they are sounding reasonable and laconic and, you know, eloquent, really, where you are become less and less so as the more and more and more you have to argue. That's basically
That's really helpful, Polina, and I think that fits in with work that I do. So, for example, I've been in grievances where the grievance outcome letter has come back, or we had a meeting about that. And that exact same process is going on, where the employers are trying to persuade the person that something completely wrong and different is the case. So I recognise that, and yeah, that could certainly come under the bullying title. So, Mary, you've suddenly appeared on screen. Are you going to say something?
I just wanted to, Norma's just left actually, and I thought the point she made about what about our own organisations? Yeah. And I think, as I referred to those young women in Glasgow who are forcing Unite to re-look at our anti-sexual harassment policy, so I think it's pretty meaningless and inactive. I just think, you know, at what point do we say we're in real trouble? We need to completely change the unions. They're still incredibly macho, and there's a real hierarchy. I think we have a real problem, and I'm very wary of this language of wins and winning, and we do it in Unite a lot, and we never seem to, as an educationalist, you know, I just think, well, at what point it's so healthy to self-criticize, and we don't do it. And we have a massive problem in terms of young members in unions and women, and it's getting worse. You know, we've got less and less women coming on training courses, and flexible work hits women so much more than COVID did, and none of these things are getting addressed, and it does worry me. And yeah, I suppose that's it. That's fine.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Mary. I mean, I'm not blowing my own trumpet here, but just as an example, my union branch has just voted to offer payment for women who want to come to our general meetings for childcare, just to try and encourage more young female members to come to the meetings, because, you know, we're very well aware that they are not coming.
I went to a meeting of the WEA about 5 years ago. A lot of young women, really good young women's conference, the WEA. Some of the older women were saying, at what point did we stop providing creches? Why did we stop providing creches? Why did we do that? Who said? What happened? And we've done it in Unite. We used to have very good creche facilities and a lot more women attending stuff, and we've stopped. So I do think, you know, Norma's point about looking at our own organisations and deconstructing the hierarchies.
So everything we've said tonight really is coming together. We've said that the answer is, you know, more trade unionism in the workplace. It's about attracting desperately more young people, but that is also going to stop, hopefully, that bullying culture that might exist, or the overarching hierarchy that might exist in traditional trade unions as well. So I suppose the outcome for tonight really is that a big part of fighting bullying is to get young people active and organising and aware of their rights, and give them the self-confidence to be able to stand up for themselves when they arrive in the workplace.